Hey, 450 crew. Hope you're doing well and staying warm today. I'm going to go over some of the content we would have covered in class today if the weather was not interfering. Um, so be sure to take some notes. The PowerPoint that this screencast is based on will be on Moodle, so it will be there. But I'm going to flesh out the information that's in the bullet points, and this stuff will be covered on the special education exam. So um, you do need to know this content for that assessment. So two things just to remember real quick from last class. We did talk about how there's two approaches to students being identified for special education services. So just as a review, you should know those two different processes for identification. Check yourself to make sure that you do know them. Okay, so what we're trying to achieve through this screencast and the forum activities that you're going to do today are two things. First, you need to know what your roles and responsibilities are in relation to IEPs. And also 504s. I'm mainly focusing on IEPs to start with. And then the second thing is you will know similarities and differences between IEPs and 504s. So a couple thoughts in relation to the reading that you did for class. First of all, for those of you who are in EDU 355, the two purposes of the IEP should have reminded you of something we were reading about for that course. So think about that for a second. If you're not in EDU 355, it's okay. The two purposes of the IEP are to define the measurable goals which the student is supposed to attain, and then the second purpose is to describe the services, the supports that are going to help the student reach those goals, and that should echo a little bit understanding by design for those of you who are in EDU 355. Okay, so moving on to transition services, those were something that was discussed in the reading and are important for high school teachers in particular. So a high schooler, their IEP may include reference to transition services, which are those services designed to help the student succeed beyond their K-12 experience. So the IEP is meant to help them be successful in school, and the transition services part that's added to the IEP towards the end of their K-12 educational career is meant to help them then be successful beyond school. And then another thing we should talk about is sort of what roles do regular education teachers play in the IEP, and the reading mentioned a couple of different things. One of them is you will be invited to attend IEP meetings. A regular education teacher must be present at any IEP meeting. It does not mean that all of the regular education teachers must be present, but at least one of the regular education teachers, the student, has to be there in order for the IEP meeting to be considered official. And so you will regularly get invited to IEP meetings. And then, of course, the other main role you have is to implement the supports that the IEP dictates need to happen in the inclusive classroom. So how are you going to be sure that you do the things that you need to do for your students? One of the first things that you're going to have to do as a regular education teacher is ask questions and seek information, because unfortunately, if you are sort of passive, it is unlikely that all of the information you are going to need to best serve your students will be provided to you. So typically what will happen is at the beginning of the school year, you'll hopefully receive an email communication of some sort, or a visit from a special education teacher or something in your mailbox notifying you of the student or students that you have that have an IEP. And you should also receive a list of accommodations. So what it is that you're supposed to do as a teacher to support that student. In my experience, if that is all you rely upon, you are generally not going to have enough information to be maximally effective in supporting the student. So there is, in the special education world, this notion that teachers, school officials are only provided with the information they need to know. So there are privacy concerns. And so the special education teachers are not just automatically going to give you all of the information they have because of those concerns about privacy and need to know. My perspective as the regular education teacher is that to successfully serve the student, I do need to know more than just the list of accommodations. So I think in most cases, if all you see is a list of accommodations, you're probably not going to be able to do the best possible job for that student. So sometimes the list of accommodations does not even say what the why the student is receiving special education services. It doesn't tell you if, for example, the student is on the autism spectrum, or if there's some sort of learning disability, or maybe even what the learning disability is. So oftentimes you have to go seek that information out. And usually it is possible to get that information. The special education departments in some schools can just tend to not want to pass out information too freely because they worry about the getting into too many people's hands and students seeing it and whatnot. So sometimes it's just an issue of you need to go down to the office in the school where all the records are kept and look at the full IEP there in that office. So oftentimes you will not actually see the full IEP. All you will see is the accommodations list, which are the things that you're supposed to do. So that's the first piece of advice, is that you should go and seek out as much information as you can about the students and their IEP and not rely upon just what is given to you initially. It may not be sufficient. Second piece of advice is do try and go to the IEP meetings as much as possible. Usually you cannot attend all of them because some of them will be scheduled at times that are not convenient for you to go to. But certainly if you get invited during when you have a planning period, you should go. And in some cases, even if you have a class, the special education department will provide coverage for you to be able to miss part of your class. And if you're strategic about it and set up, so that maybe there's something going on where you could miss 20 minutes of class because they're taking a test or something like that, that can be worthwhile. The IEP meetings can be very helpful in a lot of ways. One benefit is you often get to know the parents, which can be helpful in a number of different ways. And you can also get a sense of maybe the special education teacher and their familiarity and expertise in working with the student. Sometimes the special education teachers, you know them well and you have a chance to interact with them a lot. And at other times, the IEP meeting might be the only time you get to see them. And so it's an important opportunity to get a sense of that special education teacher and how useful of a resource they may be to you or not. So the third point in terms of things you need to do is you need to be very organized with the record keeping in relation to your students with IEPs. So when you get those accommodation lists, you need to be sure that they go in a place where they do not get lost. If they do actually share the full IEP with you, again, those need to go in a place where they're not going to get lost. So I recommend having a file in a filing cabinet, and I recommend having separate colors for your IEPs and your 504s so that you can find them quickly. It is not good if a special education teacher or a principal asks you about the IEP and what the accommodations are for a student, and it takes you 20 minutes to find the IEP or the accommodation list. So you should have a designated place where all of that information is kept, and you can find it quickly. And so that is very important. In the same way, if there's a meeting with a parent and you can't find the accommodation list or the IEP, that just doesn't look good, and it doesn't make it seem like you're serving the interests of the student. So in addition to having all of your paperwork related to your accommodations and IEP well organized, I also would recommend that on your seating chart you have some sort of shorthand that indicates which students have accommodations. In some classes you'll have a number of students with IEPs, and they'll have a variety of accommodations. And so you don't want to try and have to keep in your head all of those accommodations. And some accommodations are only rarely used, and so you may not be able to remember every single accommodation that every one of your students has. And so having a little shorthand on the seating chart is a good idea. The thing that you definitely don't want to do is fail to offer accommodations to students who have them. And so having the shorthand notes on your seating chart will help avoid that happening. Okay, another thing that you have to do with high school students is some of them will actually refuse accommodations. Those are usually around testing. They usually involve going into separate settings. So some students, for whatever social reasons, will opt not to utilize all their accommodations. So you need to have a little form where they acknowledge that. So there's no he said, she said later on about you not providing the accommodation. So what I always did is just had a little blank form, and I made 50 copies of it or whatever, and had it in a easily accessible place, and it said something to the effect of I, and then a blank where the student would write their name, am refusing my accommodation on this date, and then they would just put in the date and sign their name. And so that was a way for me to have a record that the student, for example, who had a separate setting testing accommodation, said, no, I don't want to go to separate setting, I just want to take the test here. I had a record that indicated that that was the student's choice and not my failure to provide the accommodation. So those are a few basic things that you want to be sure you do with an IEP. And during class on Wednesday, we're actually going to look at an IEP and see what a full IEP would look like. Okay, I'm going to address a couple of the questions that you guys asked in your HWQs about the reading. So one student asked, does an IEP prevent a child from having success in the real world? And this is the point of the transition services, is that it is meant to not prevent the child from having success in the real world. So I think the concern behind this question would be that a child could become so used to the accommodations that once they leave school and accommodations are not being provided, that they wouldn't be able to handle it. So the transition services are designed to sort of identify how the student is going to transition out of school into the quote unquote real world. So uh, I think that there are indeed cases where a student does not successfully transition, and um, this is a valid concern that the accommodations would become crutches that the student is not able to succeed without when they move out of the school world. Um, but to a degree, we do have to focus on the present and what the student needs to succeed in our class. And it is the special education department of your school, it is their responsibility to try and figure out how to sort of gradually increase the student's capacity to be successful longer term. The special education department will work with the student over the 4 or more years that they're in their school, whereas you're probably going to only have them for 1. And so hopefully they are thinking about that sort of success in the real world factor. One of you asked about the administration taking the time to go to classes to check up on implementation of IEPs. And I would say it's fairly uncommon that an administration is specifically checking about IEP implementation unless some questions have been raised. So it is not just sort of regular practice that they would go around looking for lack of implementation. It would be because some concern had been expressed. So either a parent or a student said, these accommodations are not happening. That would then maybe result in an administration checking up to see what the situation is. In some cases, rather than the administration, somebody from special education department might also come by a class. But in general, it's more reactive to complaints or problems that have arisen rather than sort of proactive in terms of it just being part of a standard operating procedure where they're checking to make sure that the IEP is being implemented for all students. Third question, what is an average number of IEPs to expect to have? So this will vary wildly. And one of my colleagues from Carrboro High School, I was just speaking with her 2 weekends ago, and she has a class with 16 IEPs. And so it can be, I think that's a little uncommon to have 16, but you can get anywhere from a handful to double digits. Now, typically what would happen though is it will vary by school, but there's usually a threshold at which if you have a certain number of IEPs in a class, then you either have a teaching assistant from the special education department who supports you, or you co-teach with a special education teacher. And we're going to talk more about the co-teaching process in a later class period. So if you do have a larger number of IEPs, then the idea at least would be that you would receive more support from the special education department.